As much as living in a castle sounds grand, medieval times weren't all opulence and regalness. They had a lot of ickiness, and I mean that in a lot of ways. What do you think would have been the hardest part of living back then? Let me know in the comments and let's dive into things. Let's start off with kind of a no-duh statement, but plagues were kind of rampant. Towns, cities, armies, navies, they could all lose a large fraction of people from what many viewed as an apocalyptic act of God. Sanitation wasn't actually the issue, by the way. Even peasants had access to soaps, outhouses, and teeth-cleaning mints. The issue was that malnutrition, pseudoscience, medical practices, and a general lack of experience against the variety of new plagues made treatment kind of difficult. So nowadays we all know what germs are because we can see them with microscopes. Back then the answer to stop paninis included hunting down non-Christians, hunting down black cats, hunting down vampiric witches. You get where I'm going with this. And also praying. Yes, they did quarantine people, but it didn't work as well as you want when you've got people catapulting plagues into enemy cities to intentionally spread plagues. Speaking of that medicine that was not as effective as modern medicine, some of the proposed cures for day-to-day ailments were kind of wacky. For example, cobwebs were used to treat warts, and ale was made of crushed and roasted eggshells, leaves, and petals of marigold flowers. Yeah, that's how they treated plagues, which, yeah, to nobody's surprise, didn't work too well. If a medieval soldier was wounded in battle, he didn't have to worry. As soon as somebody got cut, a doctor, following the recommendations of the king's personal surgeon, would whip out his hoo-ha and pee on your wound. And this wasn't just for like fresh cuts either. Fresh urine was used to treat sores, burns, bites, and well, anything you could think of. It was gross, but apparently it worked. The ammonia in the urine would help keep cuts from getting infected, and in life or death situations, it's worth it. I know people still do that today in like survival situations, so like I get it, but when a British family had filled their chamber pots and stuffed their house with waste and rotting foods, well, they were expected to clean it out. Now officially, they were supposed to gather up their whole mess and carry outside city limits, which was one of those ideas that sounded great on paper, but in practice, nobody was about to waste their time doing that when there was a perfectly good street to dump things right outside their front door. Trash piled up in front of people's homes, ranging from old chicken bones to emptied out chamber pots. Legend has it that people dumped their chamber pots out of their windows so often that chivalrous men were expected to let women walk on the inside of the sidewalk so that any raining feces would fall on their head instead. Oh, chivalry. Nobody even tried to stop people from dumping things on the streets until the 14th century, when King Edward II introduced England's first law against dumping poop on the road. Even then, though, it didn't really have much of an effect. The trash kept piling up and people just adjusted. Wealthy people would carry perfumed cloths against their nose whenever they stepped outside to keep from upchucking, and the king started hiring professionals to clear the filth off the road. And as awful as the roads smelled on an average day, they were so much worse after it rained because, well, these roads were made of dirt, cobblestone, and they were designed to slope into a rainwater ditch in the middle of the road to prevent flooding. This would have been great if it weren't for all the trash. So all of these rainwater ditches were stuffed full of trash. So by the time it actually rained, they were useless. Instead of stopping floods, these clogged ditches would overflow, and that would dislodge the months of trash that built up, which I'm sure you can guess, so gross. And when the sky eventually cleared up, the roads would be covered in wet trash and feces, slowly drying in the sun and stinking up the entire town. We're moving on before I upchuck. Unless you were wealthy, most homes in medieval England didn't actually have floors. Beneath a lot of folks' feet was nothing more than compacted earth covered in rushes, herbs, and grass. Covering the dirt with plants did help to keep the house warm, but it was very expensive. Also, food would fall into rushes and get buried there, luring rats and insects into homes. And it wasn't like anybody really had the time to deep clean. Usually they'd clear out the top layer and put on something new, but the bottom layer, where all the disgusting things was, it would stay untouched, often for decades. One Dutch visitor complained that English homes were harboring vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. Yep, moving on. I know I've already covered stinky places today, but few places stank worse than the River Thames. During the Middle Ages, it was considered normal practice for butchers to gather up all their unused, rotten meat, bundle it up, drag it out to the bridge, and dump it in the river. This was so common that the bridge earned itself the nickname Butcher's Bridge, and it was the most disgusting place in the whole country. It was famous for being covered in dried redness and pieces of animal entrails that had spilled out of butchers' carts. It took until the 19th century before anybody put an end to the stench. But for 500 years, London's Great River was one of the smelliest places on earth. Growing old was a challenge back then. Only about a third of everybody born reached adulthood, and giving birth was extremely dangerous, with mothers, offspring, or both not making it out alive. Across the side of that time, the average life expectancy was only about 35 years. Men usually lived a little longer than women, and the rich, of course, often lived much longer than the poor. Still, it's pretty wild that giving birth was more risky than going into battle. During the Middle Ages, violent criminals and thieves faced pretty severe consequences if caught, and there were numerous petty problems that also received cruel and unusual punishments. Being a vagrant or getting caught begging was against the law in most European locales. Peasants were forbidden to marry without their lord's permission, and in some places, women could even be punished for gossiping too much. Oh bother. Take me away now, folks. Surprisingly, even playing football became illegal in England back in in 1314. In the early part of the Middle Ages, determining guilt or innocence involved a brutal practice called trial by ordeal. So if you were a woman, you were suspected of witchcraft, well, let's see, what were we gonna do to you? All right, tie you up and toss you into the water. Now, if you survive, you're innocent. If you die, you're guilty. And seeing you've already been tied up before being thrown in, you can guess how many guilty witches there were. As time passed, trial by jury started to replace the trial by ordeal, but punishments during this era were still incredibly harsh compared to today's standards. Public executions were common, as were floggings and, well, other harmful things. Corporal punishment and forced labor were routinely levied against criminals and evildoers as well. Even petty crimes like thievery, pickpocketing were given harsh retribution. One of the most dreadful crimes somebody could commit was high treason. Betraying one's king was such a heinous act that resulted in an unimaginably cruel punishment. The condemned person would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged towards execution, and would be subjected to the rope necklace treatment, but then cut down just before death. While fully conscious, they would be disemboweled and their entrails would be burned before their eyes. Finally, an axe would be swung to sever their head from their body. Then, in what served as a brutal warning to others, their head would be displayed for all to see. And that, folks, is what we call overkill. Life back then was divided into different classes. As has been the case in most eras, those at the top had a pretty good life. They were the ones with power, money, high status. In most communities, the king technically owned all the land in an area, and he would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty. Then, these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. This privilege for the barons came at a great cost to those below them, the serfs. That was the poor mass of people who had no land, no rights, and were treated pretty poorly. They toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn till dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock, and offer some other value to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you would remain there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. Speaking of lower class, one unusual job that became popular was that of being a leech collector. The medical profession had a constant need for leeches at the time, which created an opportunity for people to make a living by gathering the little fluid-sucking creatures. Now, it wasn't like a really hard task, but it was gross. To be able to do this job, you gotta enter a suitable body of water and just wait. Wait for what? For the leeches to attach themselves to you. Now, another job that offered slightly more income was that of being a fuller. Fullers were more common than leech collectors, and they could earn 3 times as much as a peasant working in the fields. Their responsibility was to remove oil, dirt, and other impurities from newly woven cloth. The most effective method they used was stomping on the cloth with their feet inside a barrel filled with human urine. This process would go on for hours and hours, dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. Yeah, no thanks. During medieval times, the Catholic Church held immense power and influence across Europe. It had great wealth and authority too, and for one, it was exempt from taxes. But it still compelled peasants to pay a tithe of 10% of their earnings to the church. Also, peasants were obligated to dedicate their time and labor to the church's lands without compensation. The vast resources and political strength of the church allowed it to permeate nearly every aspect of medieval society. And because they had such power, worship was essentially forced. After all, who would mount a fight against an organization with that much of an ability to ruin your life? As a leader of the church and the earthly representative of God, the Pope held a level of power that rivaled and often surpassed most of Europe's monarchs. Although popes did not directly command armies, their influence was so significant that they could call for crusades. And, well, religious minorities faced the constant threat of persecution and death due to their unpopular belief systems. Because of the sheer dominance of the Catholic Church, diversity in religious practices existed at great risk to those who dared to differ. Worship was very power-driven from the top down at the time, and if you went against it, you literally risked your life. And people wonder why I'm so anti-Catholicism. And that's it for me, folks. I've been Alexa, the resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.